Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 815th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation with Harmony Hammond and Ksenia M. Soboleva. We'll conclude with a reading of poems by Timmy Straw. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Harmony Hammond is an artist, art writer, and independent curator, a leading figure in the development of the feminist art movement in New York in the early 1970s. She was a co-founder of A.I.R, the first women's cooperative gallery in New York, and Heresies, a feminist publication on art and politics. Hammond's earliest feminist work combined gender and politics with post-minimal concerns of materials and process, frequently occupying a space between painting and sculpture, a focus that continues to this day. Since 1984, Hammond has lived and worked in northern New Mexico. Dr. Ksenia M. Soboleva specializes in queer art and culture. Her writings have appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, Bomb, Hyperallergic, Art Agenda, and various exhibition catalogs. She's currently the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Gender and LGBTQ+ History at the New York Historical Society and an adjunct professor of art history at NYU. It is such an honor to have Ksenia and Harmony here on the NSE today, and I'm thrilled to pass it over to you, Ksenia.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and thank you to everyone at the Rail for making this possible, as always. I think we can get the slideshow going so that we can look at something. Harmony, it is such an honor to be in conversation with you. I sort of have to pinch myself. I know we met at the opening, but I was so shy that I didn't fully register the event. So in a way, I feel more present now. Your work as an artist, as a writer, as a curator, it's been so important to my practice as an art historian and my life as a lesbian, and really important doesn't even do justice. It's really, your work has really been critical. And I think also to others. I mean, I should only speak for myself, but really giving permission to pursue certain angles and avenues and to take myself seriously. And I love how you speak about your work. There's a real commitment. It matters, and there is an ongoing dedication, and I feel like you are constantly reorienting yourself in relation to your work and vice versa. And what I particularly admire is how you can take scraps of textile, of fabrics, and that are discarded by others or that would be considered useless by others, and you create a body, and the painting is a body, and it has a life, and this life consists of all these different lives lived by the fabrics. And so there is this real history of touch in your work that implies the body, and then before you know it, the painting becomes the body, and then of course there is your own body, which we'll talk about. But I think this is really palpable in your current show at Alexander Gray Gallery. Congratulations, which features paintings from the last 3 years. And the show is titled Accumulations. And I wanted to ask you what Accumulations references. There is the obvious accumulation of materials in your work, the layering, but where did the title come from, and what does that term accumulations mean to you? I'm going to stop talking now.
Well, I love to hear you talk, and you've given me lots of great ideas already. So thank you. Anyway, it's a pleasure to talk, to have more time than at an opening to talk together. I'm sure it'll be one of many future conversations, or at least I hope so. And as you said, the exhibition at Alexander Gray focuses on work, presents a selection of work from the last 3 years. And I titled it Accumulations for a number of reasons. For me, the notion of accumulations means a number of things. One, it does refer to the layering of materials that you can see in this painting, which is one of a painting from a chenille series. Here's the full image, which is actually older and not in the exhibition, but because I have details of the surface, which is so important to all of my work, I wanted to show this first, because accumulations refers to the accumulations of materials. In my case, as in this painting and the works at Alexander Gray, it's oil paint mixed with Dorland's wax, incorporating a lot of burlap and other fabrics that are archivally affixed to a stretched canvas. So they're very layered. And there's also, in addition to these pieces and patches of fabric that are affixed and then become the surface upon which there is painting, but then the painting and affixing more pieces and patches go back and forth. So it's not about putting it all down and then just covering it with one layer of paint. It's very much about building a surface from the inside out, or layering, which is, if you think about painting, painting is primarily, in most cases, an additive process. And that's how I work, in an additive way. And so the very materials reference this additive process or accumulation. And also you can see the grid is in here in multiple ways. And the grid is also an accumulative structure for measuring time and space. And then I would say, thirdly, my work always comes out of other work. I don't do sketches. I don't do research ahead of time. It just comes from the handling of the physical materials, and then how I manipulate them. And that's how content is, social and political contents, brought into what might be more formal abstractions. So the works currently at Alexander Gray build on the works that came prior. So that's an accumulation too. There's accumulation of visual strategies and conceptual concerns that just grow out of the work itself, that grow out of the process of just doing it, out of the process of making. Specifically, they come out of the show I had at Alexander Gray in 2020, and even earlier, back to the 70s. So like here right now, you were seeing these double quilts. Those two are earlier, they're not in the exhibition. So you have the chenille painting, you have these quilts, and if we could go back one more, you would see this double bandaged quilts. So the idea of what looks like a minimal, a beautiful minimal monochrome painting from a distance, when you get up close, there are all these pieces and patches and torn edges and fragments. And in this case, this is not just a double quilt, but a double bandaged quilt. Mm-hmm. So the idea of bandaged chenilles, like chenille bedspreads, the idea of bandaged grids, being like the bandaged modernist grid, and a grid that refers to weaving and textile arts. And then the bandaged quilts here, which again refers to a tradition of women's creative practices. But as Ksenia said, the body is always the very presence. So the materials and the visual strategies I use and the references to various women's textile arts always is referring to those textile arts, but also to the gendered body.
Mm-hmm. So many of the gestures in your paintings, like ripping, stitching, puncturing, patching, bandaging. As you say, they not only invoke the skin of the canvas, they invoke the skin of the body. And so you're constantly thinking both about the body of the painting and your own body as an artist. And I think there's also a really beautiful tension between structures of, on the one hand, care, and then on the other hand, violence, right? And I think that tension is really significant in your work. So how do you navigate the relationship between your body and the body of the painting, like in the process of making? And then, are you aware? Is this tension something that you think about very consciously, or does that sort of arrive once you've made the work?
Well, it's obviously an area of great interest to me. I don't really consciously think about it, to be honest. When I'm working, I'm just working with the materials and so forth. And I try to not get outside of myself looking at the work to critique it or to say what it's about. I try to just work, because I can change anything and I don't have to show it to anybody. So it really doesn't matter what I do in the studio, right? So there's a point where maybe at the end of the day after working, I might sit back and then look at what I have, look at how the materials are speaking to me, and I can decide if I want to pull ideas out. So it's at the end of the day, I might sit back and look with my critical eye, but I try to not have that critical eye hovering over my shoulder or the idea of exhibiting. I just work, and then I find out kind of afterwards or in the process of what it is I do. But I do very much think of the painting as the painting body. You're absolutely correct. First of all, paint is almost always a skin of paint. Physically, it is a skin of paint. It is a material that is a skin of paint. And then the painting body, especially if I wrap straps or things around the painting, the stretched canvas, hugging or perhaps confining in some way the body, the painting body, we don't know. But anyway, it's like, I think of it as a whole. So the painting body is both the physical painting itself as an object, and also, as you mentioned, it is also the body that makes the painting. And that contributes the fact that I think I'm glad you feel that. And the fact that you feel the body that made the painting, that's what brings this kind of real indexical aspect to the work. So I'm always, I just know that that's the territory I work in. And so that's pretty much how I proceed in the studio. It's just, I kind of know this vast territory of what I work in, and I just trust that process to take me somewhere. It may be more interesting in the end than where I thought I was going. It may not be the same thing, but that's okay. I'm comfortable with that. In fact, I love that.
Yeah. I think this makes me think of something that I actually included in this personal essay that I wrote recently, which is that actually in the Russian language, many of the terms applied to the word soul are commonly used in relation to clothing, like torn, worn out, overworn, and sometimes not worn enough. And it speaks to your work, I think, in a way. Harmony, you have maintained pretty much a lifelong commitment to abstraction. And since you first emerged on the New York art scene in the 1970s, at the height of the feminist movement, you co-founded A.I.R. And people tend to think of feminist artists as, figurative, the body, vulvas, and not, Judy Chicago, not that any of that work is any less meaningful, but I like thinking about feminist abstraction and artists such as yourself and Louise Fishman, who you of course knew. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship to abstraction and how that has evolved over time? And are there ways in which the term abstraction for you has shifted or has gained new or different meaning? And then how does that manifest itself in this work in particular?
that's about 6 different questions.
Yeah.
Again, I don't want this conversation to dwell in the 70s, but I was very lucky to be a participant in what would be a consciousness raising art work group in the starting from 1970 to 1974. And in our group, based in New York, we worked primarily with materials or abstraction, or the figure was there a little bit, but it's just the way we worked. We were doing a feminist analysis of the grid. We were using materials that were associated with women's traditional arts or non-Western cultures as a way to get outside that white male narrative of modernist abstraction. And so it's just kind of what we were doing, especially in New York. I mean, I certainly wasn't the only one. I was part of a large number of women who were working with materials in various ways, but with that kind of consciousness, many of the women, like myself, we kind of abandoned painting for a while, actually, because it was such a male territory where we were really not wanted. You know, as the makers, we were not wanted, nor were women's experiences and lives wanted, particularly in terms of being subject matter or being important enough as subject matter, being important enough as references for the work in terms of its content and so forth. So back then, you know, what was so radical about feminism at that time was just that we took ourselves and our work very seriously. And then we went where we wanted to go. We didn't need to keep pushing at the walls to get into into the doors or whatever. We just created our own spaces, made our own work and so forth. Coming forward, if I can remember your questions, is I don't really think about abstraction. In other words, when I go into the studio, it's not like I'm doing a kind of abstraction where you start with a figure or a still life or something, and then you look for simple shapes or forms, and you begin to develop it that way, and the representational reference begins to disappear. Like I said, I work with materials and the process, that is the physical manipulation of those materials. So ripping something is very different than cutting it, for instance. Okay. So that the verbs, the ways that the materials are manipulated, bring content as much as the various materials. But of course, materials or objects that are brought into the painting field, or any artwork for that matter, also have their histories, and they bring associations, references, possibly suggested narratives into the work. So it's kind of in that very large territory that I work, and I move back and forth over the years. So there's some works here in the Alexander Gray show that include domestic textiles. Well, those start to bring a different kind of narrative presence into the work that's different than the paintings that rely entirely on what burlap, for instance, which people may or may not recognize as burlap because the paint has sutured it all together. So let me just say, when I go into the studio, because I don't do sketches, advanced sketches, and I don't do research in advance, I'm not really thinking about abstraction. I'm not thinking about feminism. I'm not thinking about being a lesbian. I'm not thinking about queer abstraction. I don't even put music on. I like listening to I like the process of working, of the handiwork. I like listening to wherever my mind goes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to have it filled up. I like to have a space where I can listen to my own thoughts, which is how I learn about what I'm doing in the paintings and how I and the work relate to the larger world, in fact. And I think one of the reasons I don't play music, in fact, is, you know, I was a single mother. I am a single mother. And also I've taught for, you know, decades. And I just really like quiet after all of that.
I'm the same way, actually. I stopped listening to music when I run because I can't hear myself think. And I realized that if I run without music, it's a more meditative experience. But do you think about painting when you're making the work?
No, I don't think about painting. I just paint.
Just do it, yeah.
I just paint. And like I said, it's in and out and back and forth, and it's layered. It's about accumulation, an accumulation of ideas and concerns as the paint surface itself accumulates. It's not about getting anywhere quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's,
yeah,
it's actually about lingering, in fact.
Yeah, yeah. I think that
I would say lingering is very sensual.
I would agree. Yeah, I think the process is inherent to the work. The process is the work, right? And when I look at these, to me, you know, your body is always implied, and your body is a queer body, you know. And so I think that even if you're not consciously thinking about that, I do think that there is this significant relationship that is always present. I wanted to hear more about, you mentioned domesticity, because indeed there are linens in some of the pieces that are repurposed tablecloths and I believe towels and quilt covers. And what is your relationship to domesticity today? And you mentioned, you know, you are a single mother. What is the domestic realm?
Well, again, it's not a focus of intense thought, but it's just like a lot of gendered creative practices. I work with what's at hand in terms of materials.
Mm-hmm.
And also, to even before you got to the domestic linens, I can say that, you know, yeah, I just work with what's at hand. And so the domestic linens are things I have used in and out over the years in different bodies of work. So they're around, and there's something I can grab at any time. It's all about, it's like I work through a lens of feminism and queerness. Okay, I just work through that lens, and so I can grab these different things. But I have done other work, say with repurposed quilts.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I use them, I'm just aware that when I grab a fabric that's very recognizable, it's not just a rag. You know, it's not just a rag. It's not, and it's not just even a piece of fabric, but all of a sudden it's elevated to a textile, for instance. They're all very a little different there. And then we can recognize, oh, it's a placemat. Oh, it's a curtain. Oh, it's a towel or a quilt. That automatically brings in another layer of meaning. And because I associate these gendered fabrics or textiles with the gendered body, they are one way that I then can create a space between the actual textile in the work and the painting textile, because canvas, of course, is a textile, and then there's a burlap. And the space in between the textile and the body is that place of metaphor. Mm-hmm. That's the space of metaphor. And I think that's where my work at its best operates, in that space, which is between painting and sculpture and between the actual material and its kind of metaphorical weight, or how it is used pictorially. And that's a space, again, I just seem to inhabit and move around in. And at this point, because I've been working for so long, I just trust that. It's not a process I question. It's just kind of like what I do, in the same way that I know I can also just trust my work. And this sounds maybe a little corny, but it's something that I learned early on, which was my work would never take me anywhere I can't handle. And so I trust making my work in the studio. What I show might be another thing. I also know this space that I move in, and I just trust that process. I don't need an end result at the end of the day. Like I said, it's not about getting anywhere fast. And I think what I'm talking about here, it may sound kind of, well, abstract, but it's kind of how I live my life. I mean, how I live my life is how I paint, and how I paint is how I live my life.
That actually makes me think, and I love that we're looking at a cross right now, that there are several pieces that either are a diptych or have a cross. And I wonder, you're talking about trust, which also, could be, you could say, a certain faith in your work. Is there a way in which you think of your practice as religious or spiritual?
No, not really, not really. The cross shape, which I began making these cross paintings in the summer of 2019. And at the time I started making them, in other words, I didn't intend for them to be crosses or crossings. I thought I was doing something like X marks the spot. And then I had these big, but in my studio, I have these big crosses, and I had to kind of eventually acknowledge, oh, they are reading as crosses. So then it's kind of like, all right, what are these crosses made out of? It's like they're made out of burlap sacks that are cut open. So they become like big cross or plus shape bandages in a funny way. And what I like is that the cross itself is a very slippery or fugitive or indeterminate symbol, that refers to a lot of things like medical and humanitarian care, as well as modernist painting and, of course, religion. So I like the fact that this kind of indeterminate symbol, which I have to acknowledge reads like a cross, or as I like to think of, as a crossing or an intersection or a plus sign, the plus being accumulative again. There's kind of a tension between that, the thick painted surface with this kind of slippery symbol. And so, and in fact, in this particular cross painting, the black cross painting that we have up here, it's actually quite agitated. If you look at it, there's things pushing up from underneath. And this is what you saw in that early painting we started the slideshow with. There's things pushing up from underneath. So in all my work, or all this body of work, is what looks like a kind of off-white surface with a grid of grommeted holes. Well, when you get up and you get in close, there's color that is inserting itself from underneath, staining that surface, oozing out of the grommet holes, pushing up under the black cross here. If you look at the top edges and so forth, it's looking like that cross wants to jump out of the canvas rectangle. Or is it struggling to fit in? So they're very active, and yet what is the background, I would say, is as active and has as much agency as the cross form itself. And for those, because I know people just looking at this slide don't have a sense of scale, but the cross shape itself is somewhat human scaled, a little bit larger. The cross, of course, on one level is an abstract form, stand-in for the figure. But it also, if you think about burlap coffee sacks, they are of a physical size that someone carries them with their body. And in most cases, I'm not cutting the coffee sack up into little pieces. I'm just opening it up and leaving the seams from along the edges visible. So there's a lot of layers in the ways the body is present that people might not be aware of. And I don't think they need to be, I mean, they don't need to know all that. They don't need to know that where the burlap came from. But the fact that the seams are there, the fact that in this painting, you can see that background is pieced and patched together and sutured with paint. The paint holds the painting together in the way that painting holds me together. So that's how I think. And we can see that this off-white or warm white background in this particular painting is got kind of gold or dark reds and browns that push through and stain that surface. And so all the work in a certain way is about what's buried, what's underneath. All of it is about voice in a funny way, about what has been, what voices have been buried, muffled, what disenfranchised or marginalized voices are underneath there, but are asserting themselves.
I love that you've told us about this process of making the holes, because my first reaction was one of, oh, this is like somehow a violent gesture, you know. I thought these are maybe bullet holes. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized they're also, you're creating, you know, talk about crossing, you're creating passageways, right? And you're creating orifices, and there is, like, what these holes do is also they create a release, and the painting is able to leak. And am I correct? I feel like somebody told me that there is a painting that has actual bullet holes, or no?
There is. Well, there's work that have had bullet holes in them. When I've used found objects, like old buckets or pails, sometimes,
or like the animal bones.
They might have. They sometimes have been previously used as target practice. So pieces like that, where the violence was previously, you know, on the found or repurposed object, which could be a skull, a horse skull, or it could be an old rusty bucket, or it could be, you know, roofing tin, other materials. Yeah, sometimes they have been violated, you know, but in this case, you're right on. I mean, in this case, the grommets are embedded in the painting surface and also protrude from it. So literally, quote, in relief. And so there is always an edge of violence in my work. And very often you don't see it till you get up close. Then you feel that edge of violence, which I think is usually there, you know. And formally, the grommeted holes, I mean, we can get into where do grommets come from? What are their references? There's, again, all of that, which is in the pieces, because they basically are used to protect holes. Okay, for connecting devices. My work is about connection a lot. But in this case, the grommets pictorially open up that painting space. I mean, they physically open up the pictorial space, I should say. And that's where that clue of there's a narrative of something underneath. They open up the surface so that we begin to think about what's buried there. And at the same time, as you noted, referencing body orifices, and body orifices, choose your orifice, is all about passage. So you're on target.
Can we go to slide 16? Actually, I would love to look at that work more, because I think this is my favorite piece in the exhibition. And this is a piece where I really feel that tension between healing and bleeding. And I'm wondering how you think of, I'm wondering how you think about repetition in your work, and the repetition of, would you say that the repetition of stitching, right, that repetitive gesture of stitching, is it something that is reparative, or is it something that in a way erodes?
Mm.
Erodes?
That's a great question, because I think the short answer is it can be either. And so going back to the way my feminist artist friends from the 70s, and we talked about the grid and the repetitive nature of the grid, we connected it very much to both repetition in women's lives, repetition of daily chores and so forth in women's lives, but also the repetition of the ritual gesture, the meditative aspect of the repetitive gesture, be it in painting or weaving or whatever. And that part always interested me as well. In this particular painting, what's a little bit different in this painting, which is called Bandaged Grid, La Mesa, referring to table in Spanish, is that the bandaged grid in the top part, the bandages have been put on to kind of heal this grid of holes, but they've been ripped off. And you can see the ridges in the surface. They're almost like scar tissue that have been ripped off the painting body and repositioned back on. So, and the fact that that happens, that the violations to women's bodies and women's creative practices repeats itself over and over and over again. I mean, look at Roe versus Wade, okay? It's whether it's happening literally to the physical, to gendered physical bodies, or in the way of the kind of violence, you know, in terms of not having, you know, access to abortions. This is all about, there's a repetition of patriarchal violence against women's bodies and women's creative traditions. So all that is kind of back in here in ways that I hope people feel. And it's more about, I think I'm most interested in people feeling content than literally seeing content. How do they feel content on their bodies? I think that's what I aim for. Not always easy to do, needless to say. So in this particular painting, we could also say that that top part is almost the table setting, the place setting, if we would, the place setting. And that grid, that pure modernist grid, is disrupted because stuff does ooze out of the holes, or some of them. Sometimes they're clogged. That's another issue. And then they are bandaged over. And wherever there's a bandage, there's a wound, but possibly also a healing. It's at least being tended to or cared for. Yeah. The fact that this embroidered table, this torn embroidered tablecloth with holes in it is set below, kind of like a footnote or an addendum. For me, it's about, again, presencing women's traditional arts, of course, but also it is clearly a domestic textile, and therefore it places what's going on in the top part of the painting back within the domestic environment. It's not about what's going on in my house here. It's larger than that.
I love thinking about
Sorry, long answers to your very good
No. That was great. Thank you. And I know you don't want to dwell on the 70s, but I have to ask.
Oh, here we go.
especially with Roe versus Wade, you know, I can make the question very short, and I can just ask, are you tired?
Of course I get tired. I'm 79 years old. What do you think? But no, you know, we have to be ever vigilant. That's what I feel. I have seen change. I have seen change that we women have made, that feminists have made, and we're obviously dealing with many of the same issues, and we will have to continue. There's no choice. What do you do? You have to continue. You must remain vigilant, and we must give voice, or we all have, all have a responsibility to give voice to this as much as we can in whatever ways that we can. And so that's what I do. It's just what I do.
Because on the one hand, and I understand not wanting to dwell on the 70s, you've had a very long career and you probably get the same questions over and over again. But at the same time, you are still very committed to feminist issues. And you do stay vigilant. And I think that is very admirable.
Once you're a feminist, you don't unbecome a feminist. Once you've walked through that open door, it is now a lens, not just how you view the world, but how you move through the world. Mm-hmm. So I can't not do that. It's just who I am,
Yeah. I know that your work is often, placed in dialogue with artists like Alberto Burri and Eva Hesse. I think also about Lee Bontekoe. Are there artists that your work is informed by, or who you're looking at, or feel that your work is in dialogue with, that we might not be thinking of?
Well, Bontekoe and Burri are two artists that really do interest me. When I first started working with the burlap sacks in the like 2018, or even earlier than that, and cutting them up, because I liked the texture. Not all burlap sacks have the same texture, the same weave to them. And I knew I liked the seams, and this is another chenille painting here, and those, you can see the vertical seams. So you can see different textures here. And I was using that material for those visual reasons, not because the coffee sacks had anything to do with tropical rainforests in South America. But it took me a long time to kind of sort that out. So for instance, if you walked in my studio back then, you would have seen a lot of the brown burlap affixed to canvases. And it was very beautiful, but I didn't know where to go for it. It took me about a year to know where to go with it. In other words, I'm not interested in redoing Burri, but he does it quite well, But the kinship is certainly there, using ubiquitous material, using it for its physical properties, using it when it is destroyed or aged or weathered or has holes. I don't usually sew on mine in the way that he does, but I would say his work and Bontekoe's are, I would love somebody to write about my work in relationship to their work, or to have an exhibit with their work or something, because we would begin to see what are the conversations, what are the shared similarities, shared visual strategies, what's the shared content, and what's different, what's different. They both engage openings or holes.
Yeah. Has nobody written on that?
No, you want to?
Yeah, I'll do it. I sort of assumed that there was probably.
Yeah, no, it's there.
I'm sure it's in a dissertation somewhere.
Yeah, they're there, and it's just, those are the connections there. And I feel very, I respond to a lot. I personally like a lot more sculpture than I like a painting, to be honest. But in terms of painting, my work does, actually my work, sculptural work, has a lot to do with Eva Hesse, which of course was material and body based again. But in terms of painting, I like artists like Tapies or Dubuffet, Rauschenberg, artists who again were working with the very materials, starting there. Even somebody like Kiefer, the painting surface.
Mm-hmm. And your work used to be more sculptural, and I would say that the paintings are still sculptural. But what informed that transition more towards painting?
Well, there wasn't a transition. I find that really interesting that you asked that, because actually I'm trained as a painter.
Mhm.
And I start out as a painter. I'm a painter who made some sculptures. Okay. And
Yeah.
I would say that those sculptures are painterly. Many people would say they could tell a painter made those sculptures. Now,
Mhm.
what do I mean by that? And I think one of the things goes back to what I was talking about, that additive process from the inside out. I rarely carve into or incise. When I do, it has meaning, but it's the way I build sculpture or three-dimensional forms is in a painterly additive way, building from the inside out. So the wrap sculptures I made, they're not about stuffing forms. They're about building a form from the inside out.
Yeah.
So my painting, like I said, my background is painting, and I think all the work, so whether we're looking at painted sculpture or paintings that are in relief or shaped or something, we're talking about this space between painting and sculpture, which, we could call that a queer space, a third space, a queer space. And I just see, again, seems to be where I hang out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that what I'm revealing here is that I really love your floor pieces and the H-shaped sculptures, and those were the first works that I became familiar with when I started, working on my research. Yeah, Harmony.
Even thinking in terms of painting, thinking about expanding painting.
Mhm.
How do you expand painting? Well, you can take it off the wall for starters and put it on the floor. You can change the outside perimeter so it's no longer a square or a rectangle. You can work in relief off the surface. So all those things are what contributes to ideas of expanded painting. And of course, there are others as well. Yeah. This is a painting, Red Cross, which is not in the exhibition. So we've been looking at paintings that were in the exhibition. And I've thrown these in at the end just because they were made during the same time as the paintings in the exhibition, but were too large to fit in the gallery. But they're part of this body of work. And so I don't want to get caught up in here in the details on these. Maybe we could just show these images, but again, this is a big Red Cross, obviously, with a very pieced and patched background. And if we could go on to the next, there's a series of what I call double crosses. Obviously, two, and that's that whole another conversation about doubling, which I think of as doubling and twos is always about sameness and difference. And then in this case, of course, double cross, the words indicate or suggest a betrayal of some sort. So if we could go to the next double cross, that would be great. Here, the double crosses are made out of the actual seams.
I see. What's hanging in the middle?
That's what's leaning against there, is kind of propped on the floor, is a piece of wood that has almost like a steps going up it. It's a decorative piece of wood that I've just crudely painted, but it kind of plays off of the seams, which I always think of as kind of spines in a way, that figurative sense. So it's kind of figurative, but it also feels like steps or a spine, or is it going somewhere? And then the rope, which I have used also, is very similar, of course, to the rope that's in the seams. Like I said, I don't like digital seamlessness. I like the piecing, the connecting, the showing, to always be visible because it's so important.
It makes me think of Sarah Rapson also. Do you know that artist?
Oh, yes, she's in Lesbian Art in America, I believe.
Yeah.
I've lost track of her, though. Yes.
She just had a show at Maxwell Graham Gallery. I think it came down, but there were a lot of these like wooden pieces that were sort of
yeah.
against the
I
wall.
have no idea, but it's the idea of a prop is in a number of my works. I mean, it's again a visual strategy I just use over the years. These things kind of come and go, the threads in the work. But what does it mean to have something sitting on the floor, but leaning against the wall? as if it's holding the painting body in place.
Mhm.
That's how I think of it.
I love that. The
And
previous,
it's propped, so it's vulnerable. It can get knocked over easily.
yeah. The previous work, the double
Yeah.
crossing, you're
Yeah.
gonna think I'm so silly, but I look at this and what I see is a lesbian couple. One is wearing brown leather pants and the other one is wearing black leather pants.
Oh, cool. I like that. Okay.
This is my art historical reading. Harmony, I did want to ask you about scale actually, and because a lot of the pieces are very large, but then you also do make smaller work. What are those decisions informed by, and how do you think about scale in your work?
Mostly the scale, again, evolves out of the process. I mean, I'm very lucky. I have a large studio. I live in the expansive New Mexico landscape. I'm, as I say, a space queen. I like big spaces, interior and outdoors. And I work, it's large, but I mean, what's large is just relative. It's just relative, you know. And this piece, which was just up at Frieze in New York, is large, and I don't have the actual dimensions here, but they're kind of, I tend to work in certain proportions or sizes, and they have very much to do with my body and the space my body occupies. And that comes from my martial arts background, which is about how do you relate to the space around you, and how do you fill space. And in fact, even notions of filling space is a feminist concept. We literally, back in the 70s, talked about taking space and filling space.
Mm-hmm.
And that indeed is what we have done and continue to do. So for me, what was very exciting about back then, or what was really important back then in the 70s, was this emerging women's liberation movement and my feminist consciousness about taking space, inhabiting space, having the right, just thinking I had the right to take space, and then taking it and holding it. And it's when I began to study Tai Chi Chuan and Aikido, the Aikido of which I studied for 36 years and taught. So they are very much, they provided genderless forms. The martial arts provided genderless forms for me to fill and hold space. They were a physical enactment of feminist consciousness in a certain way. And the two of those combined were and remain extremely powerful. And so when I work in the studio, I think I don't even I never even measured the doors like to my studio. I just kind of know the proportions, the space, and move from within that, you know. Some pieces, you know, there are pieces that you really want to do tiny or small, but for the most part, that's not where I work. There were a series of what I call cinches, which were torso sized, which were, it looked like ribs or, you know, bondage straps or something like that around what literally was a torso sized painting. Those I was very conscious of at the time. The latex rubber torso that you saw here with the red cross on it, that is literally torso or chest size. No, it's a latex rubber piece that's framed. And it, of course, because it's latex rubber, the other way. There it is, right before this one. There we go, thank you. So this piece is latex rubber. It's like a slab of latex rubber, and latex rubber always calls up the body. It just does. It's one of those materials. And in this case, the scale of it definitely calls up either a chest or a torso or a shield, a body shield, perhaps, you know. And the red cross on it, of course, comes with all those other associations of crossings and intersections and plus signs and medical and humanitarian needs. And so for me, this piece in the show at Alexander Gray is actually central and key to the other works, because it brings that sign symbol of the cross literally together with the body in a more direct way that it's there in the more the other paintings in a way,
Yeah, and there's something very erotic about it too, actually, almost like a dental dam.
Oh,
Big
that's interesting.
Big
Yeah.
thing in the 70s. And then the other, really the I think before we run out of time, the last question that I wanted to get to is the question of color, because the colors are, primarily bodily, earthly, and so and then there is that, in this show at least, there is that presence of red, right? So what role does color play?
Again, over time, I tend to work in this idea of near monochrome, of becoming monochrome or unbecoming monochrome. And of course, monochrome, when we think of monochrome paintings, it's usually one color, one surface all over. And I interrupt that. I mean, it's a prime example of how I both participate in certain narratives like that of monochrome painting, but I also interrupt it or disrupt it. And that can be done through a seam bursting open, or can by the introduction of a color. It could be the golds, the reds, the browns seeping through from underneath, or it could be that red slit or rupture in the surface. And so I do use color referentially, but it's not, it's not attached to the figure in any way whatsoever, but has its associations. And red blood is always, red is always red blood. It's always blood, dried blood, or red earth. In this painting, for instance, which we haven't talked about, patched, here again, of course, this is incorporated a repurposed quilt cover that I had for years, for decades. I don't even remember where I got it, in some kind of yard sale or something. And I have stretched it over a canvas, so it is literally out of shape or out of kilter, trying to fit in some way. And it was stained and dirty and ripped. And so I have done, if you look carefully, even within the off-white areas, there's a lot of patching going on, which I have done to repair, to restore, to, and in this, again, and then in the center, and again, this isn't something everybody needs to know, but in the center, what you would see, I'm sorry, I don't have details of these more recent paintings, but in the center, there are small 2-inch square patches of soft cotton that have been cut or slit. They're intentionally slit and gendered. And there what looks like bleeding coming out of them. And if you notice, they are placed within what we could call the cross shape of the negative spaces within the quilt. So once again, what I'm trying to do here is to bring that tradition of women's creative practices, in this case, quilting, together with the gendered body. And in the way that, going back to your earlier question, it is violent. It's talking about it's a grid again, it's repeated violence over and over to women's creative traditions and women's physical bodies in patriarchal culture. It's brought the two together. So, and it is patched, and it will continue. The violence, unfortunately, continues, and we will continue to patch it, to heal it.
I think that is a beautiful note to end on. Harmony, I think that you are quite magnificent, and I could talk to you all day, but we did hit an hour, and I think we have some questions from the audience, so I'll give it over to Eleanor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ksenia and Harmony. I have to agree, you are magnificent, and it's been such a joy to hear these insights on your work. And thank you for the amazing questions, Ksenia. We do have some questions from the audience, and if anyone would like to ask a question, additionally, please raise your hand or send a message in the chat, and I'll be happy to pass the mic over to you. The first question from the audience today will be from our friend GE.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you, Ksenia and Harmony. Thank you so very much. The question is, can you talk a bit about inserting a queer bodily presence into rural America and into especially the pieces themselves? And this came up in my head because I was thinking very much as the work in some ways is being almost adjacent to the same kind of approach, maybe not unlike the Jasper Johns did with his Diso beach paintings, like Studio 1964, where he's working he's gone back to a very rural area, and really trying to do his darndest to make it happen.
Well, it's an interesting question. Thank you. I can't address the Johns painting at all, but what I can say is it's not in this particular, not overtly at least, or any way that I'm aware of in this particular body of work that we're focusing on today, but in earlier work of mine, there was a series called Farm Ghosts, where I was repurposing materials that I found on abandoned farms and using the corrugated roofing tin or the linoleum, fragments of linoleum that were found in these abandoned sites. Because when you go to an abandoned farm, it's about place. It's a peopled space, even if there aren't people there anymore. And we begin to construct a narrative of who lived here, what went on here, what were the secrets, what were the violences, what happened here, why is it no longer inhabited? So all those questions are there. And when I was working on that series, one of the things that I was became aware of, not in every work, but in many of the works, was, who's to say that the farmer's a man, first of all? There are a lot of women farmers, and there are a lot of lesbian couples out in, or same-sex couples and lesbian couples out in rural America. I can attest to that, and we all know that. Like, we know that, but it's always just assumed, oh, there's the farmer and his wife. Wrong. So there's just ways that in the titling or things that I did in some of those paintings that I'm thinking of a painting called Inappropriate Longings that I did, for instance, and it's very much addresses that issue, very much, where there was violence against a woman because she was a lesbian type, yeah, and it's in that painting.
Thank you so very much for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great question, GE, and thanks, Harmony. Our next question will be from Carolyn.
Hi, thank you so much, Harmony, for this talk. So I'm thinking about the animacy in your work in relation to this idea of vigilance, like the agitated, nature of your work. That's full of stitching, doubling, seam, all the verbs that you said that are involved. And I guess also accumulation as being like a kind of constant movement that will never maybe even stop. And I was just, when you were talking about vigilance, I was thinking if there's any relation there, like I'm also thinking about the Daughters of Bilitis motto, the qui vive, like be alert. And I guess also in terms of visibility and obscurity, which is making me think about your weaving. And so it's not a fully formed question, but I'm wondering what if you see like a relation between this obscurity, visibility, and the kind of alive nature of your work in terms of vigilance at all.
well, I'm not sure entirely what your question is, but I'll try to address it. I think what I've been trying to say in the paintings and maybe explain here is just that perhaps we could use what I'm talking about in this building of a painting surface and things from underneath, voices. We're talking about color and materials but they symbolize voices that have been marginalized or buried underneath, muffled over, asserting themselves from underneath and presencing them on the surface in some way. And I think we could take that, what I'm describing as what I sort of generally do, as almost a parallel or to what you're talking about historically. The historical activism of voices speaking out in many ways, however they could, over decades and decades of time. So they are now presence. I mean, the relatively recent queer histories are based on earlier gay and feminine and women's liberation histories, you know. And so I think it mirrors that, is all I can say in some way. It's not what I try to do, but I think that's there.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn. Our final question today will be from Chloe.
Thank you, Harmony and Ksenia, for this incredibly enlightening conversation today. This has been so luminous and has left me with so many areas to continue thinking. Harmony, I really love how you talk about physicality really in relationship to your work and rendering physical this kind of life and movement and constant reshaping. And I wonder how that relates at all to your work in language as well, because you also have written a lot about other artists and cultivated a discourse over the course of your life and rendered a community physical as well. And I wonder if that has impacted your work over the years and how.
Well, interesting to think about. I rarely make, first of all, I rarely, but occasionally make work that I'm consciously aware of it, the visual work relating to any of the textual work I do. There are pieces that do that, but those are rare. And of course, there's another whole conversation of when I actually use words in visual work. And that's another discussion. What are the words and how are they used? That's another whole discussion. Mostly, I think the connection between the two for me, it actually goes back to that women's group that I talked about in the early 70s, because we talked about work differently than the way you learn to talk about it in art school. We used consciousness raising as a structure to critique our art, to talk about our work and to critique it. So if you think about that structure, it's a circle. Everybody has the same amount of time to talk. We talked about, first of all, what do you see there in that, I'm going to say art object, and what is physically there? And then what does it call up, or what are your associations to it and so forth? But starting with the object, and then we would move on to the next person. The artist never got to talk during this process. We just got feedback, okay? At the end, then the artist could talk and address the different issues. And it became, the reason I'm bringing it up is it became a model for critique for me that I use both when I teach, so that there's what I call, constructive criticism when my students critique each other's work. And it's also gave me a way of looking at art, a way of reading the art objects, pieces, to get at what's there, what's the artist's intention, And I think I bring that kind of I'm going to say critical practice, which is about how I look and how I translate what I'm seeing and feel on my body into then hopefully when I'm writing or curating and looking at the work of other artists. One of the things that's interesting to me is in these, the last big red and big gold paintings, which you saw, in how it started to happen with these bandaged grids, that the bandages which were put over the openings or moved around actually are horizontal lines, pieces of scraps of fabric, fragments of text perhaps, horizontally pulled over the holes or wounds in the painting surface. And so I've begun to actually think of them strangely as text or sentences, or how we use words to cover over and bandage in some way. It's just a lot of threads of thoughts.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much for that answer.
Thank you for good questions, everybody.
Yeah, really great questions. Thank you so much. And yeah, just again, thank you, Harmony and Ksenia, for this incredible dialogue. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And unfortunately, Timmy Straw is unable to join us live here today, but we're lucky to have their friend Ksenia to read their words in their place. And Ksenia, back over to you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Yes, Timmy sends their regards. They're very sad. They can't be here, and they're not allowed to look at screens right now. But I am going to read the two poems that they were going to read, and I feel very honored that I'm allowed to read for them. So this one is titled Copernicus. You're always in the middle of the poem, even at the end. More and more you are tied by ropes, foliage, and as you move, the bindings grow around your knees, your feet. Again and again you pass your own footprints on the grass, on floors. Once more you have tracked mud into the house, have tracked a house into the mud. Outside the poem are sirens, fires, ocean hitting, pier. Say to yourself, does not cohere, but is subsumed and must not. Outside the poem, a little vein clicks in the forehead of a financier. A cue called, an oboe, truncheons, pigeons, rain, mineralizes the colonnade. A chorale stands up, taller than a building, false in sense, numerically true. You despise these techniques. You have not got to the truth yet. A truck downshifts on the freeway, a shift whistle blows. Someone else's emergency makes the poem hold. At night, like notes pushed under doors, sounds come in, flypaper in an open window, your mother rubbing lotion on her hands. All this is with you, is you, runs after you into the dark like those men after Copernicus, like a planet chased by telescopes into space. So that is the first. And the second poem was published in the last issue of Paris Review, which is very exciting. And it's titled Brezhnev. And I actually heard Timmy read it out loud. They had like a reading event. The globe sits on the spinet next to the bent brass lamp and a stack of music, brackish Hannon, then Scarlatti, the bubbling idea shut up in its notation, a few fingerings penciled in, and on the title page a signature, blue as airless Eisenhower, of some past teacher, old woman, old man. The globe sits in the room, sits in the house, silent as a Christmas fruit, shag carpet like a mascot spur, a house where one might pace and toast a slice of the only kind of bread available at the time, might speak the only speech available at the time. A tracked home at the winking edge of town, and then the West, disconsolate guest on this dark earth. And in this living room, sick with chicken pox or flu, looking through National Geographic, the only one we had, old and Berlin-hard and yellowing. Those photographs of Brezhnev's death, of Brezhnev's corpse in state, the forced lily stuffing his coffin, the million mourners in their threadbare Kremlin. This was our enemy with whom we danced a half-century and could not see. One face there I thought I understood, a little girl's. There is the continent, delicate pink, and ours, delicate blue. And there are things we learned but did not know and could not say, and what I said to you, I said the only way I knew. That's it. Thank you.
That
Timmy Straw.
was so beautiful. Thank you for reading those, Ksenia, and sending our thanks to Timmy for their amazing words, and hoping that they recover soon, can read another time. And yes, everybody to go check out their work in the Paris Review. There's a link in the chat. And thanks again, Harmony and Ksenia. It's been seriously amazing. And thank you also to Hillary from Alexander Gray Associates for supporting today's event with helping to prepare. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible. They also support our growing archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has been a platform for arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication that's free, and public events like our daily NSE. Check the chat for a link to donate to support our work at the Rail, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation about the work of Komar and Melamed. We will conclude with a poetry reading by Eugene Odashevsky, and you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for tuning in today, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harmony.
Thank you so much, Harmony.
Thank you.
And yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Oh,
Ksenia.
Fong.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Fong.
send the thanks to
Thank you,
Timmy.
Harmony. It's great.